Alright, this video series is long overdue and probably should have been made right after the Duginism one, but these things take time to research and make, and time is a precious, limited commodity. Anyway, so while it is not true that Putin hacked the US elections, or that the Kremlin is at fault for Brexit, or whatever conspiracy baloney is fashionable today amongst the extreme left, that doesn't mean that Putin is the good guy, nor does it mean that Russia is a great place. It could be, and it certainly was before the Bolsheviks took over, but it is not implicitly true that it is now, just because the dying left-wing establishment in the West is absolutely mental. The left going nuts, spewing complete lunacy about Russia does not justify false and or misleading stances about Russia, like Paul Joseph Watson recently did. So in the following minutes we will take a look at the facts rather than what RT or Sputnik says in English about Russia. So without further ado, let us begin. Chapter 1. Islam. Way too many social conservatives in Europe and beyond seem to genuinely believe that Putin is tough on Islam, that Putin doesn't bow to radical Islam, or that Russia in general isn't a place where Islam has any significant presence. That's all fine and dandy, except none of that is true. First of all, we should absolutely mention the Sharia-controlled Chechenskaya Oblast, or as they're now called, the Chechen Republic, with Grozny as its capital city. Well, it's still called Grozny, though there have been many attempts to rename it as Ahmad Kala, after Ahmad Kadyrov, the notorious Chechen Wahhabi Sufist cleric and first president of the Chechen Republic. Sufism is the most batshit crazy version of Islam one can imagine. The head of ISIS is a Sufist. Most of the clergymen in Saudi Arabia are Sufist, and generally, almost without exception, those who commit the most atrocious Islamic crimes tend to be Sufists. And when they're not Sufists, they're either Wahhabi or Deobandi, which are basically versions of Sufism that differ in the degree of absolute power allowed to the dictator. Anyway, Grozny used to be 60% Russian and 75 to 80% Christian way into the 1990s. The whole province was around 25% Russian and roughly 50% Christian. But then the Chechen Wars happened, with the Islamists ethnically cleansing all non-Chechens during the First and the Second Chechen War in mid-1990s. For instance, the province used to have a significant Armenian population. Now there are maybe 10 Armenian families? Maybe. They definitely have no church anymore, the Soviets took care of that, and the post-Second Chechen War Islamist authorities made sure none is being built again. In any event, the Chechen conflict was settled by Putin. How? By rubber stamping an Islamist dictator in the region in exchange for that Islamist dictator to kiss up to him. The current dictator in Chechnya is Ramzan Akhmatovich Kadyrov, the son of the first Islamist dictator mentioned earlier. Chechnya is now a hereditary Islamist dictatorship that is comparable in most aspects with Saudi Arabia. I say in most aspects because visiting Chechnya as a foreigner is virtually impossible. In fact, it's very difficult even for native Russians, even though you won't hear that on Russia Today, which still insists to this day that Chechnya is just as part of Russia as St. Petersburg is, except it isn't. It's hard to keep up with the Kremlin propaganda. And just like in most Islamist countries, roughly 40% of newborn children in Chechnya have some kind of a genetic defect as a result of the Islamist Sufist tradition of marrying one's cousins. Forced marriages, especially by allies of the dictator, are the absolute norm, and the Kremlin knows about it and calls this stability. Just like they called it stability when Kizir Egiev, a senior lecturer in economics at Grozny State Oil Technical University, fell off a cliff. He just happened to fall off a cliff a few days after he commented about Kadyrov's pilgrimage to Mecca and the Islamist abuse. The journalist who reported that the injuries are simply not consistent with falling off a cliff, but rather with systemic beatings with police bats, well, that journalist is still missing to this day. Well, okay, but Chechnya is a special case, you would say. They've always been problematic to Russia. Surely that doesn't mean generally Russia is friendly with Islamism, right? Well, again, taking a look at the facts. And the facts are as follows. Since Vladimir Putin took the helm of the country, slightly more than one mosque per day was built in Russia, which makes Russia a world leader in terms of mosques and of mosque growth, putting even Erdogan's sultanic aspirations to shame. After the migrant crisis in Europe, Russia did fall second in terms of most Muslims per capita. Bulgaria's Muslim population is 13.7% of the country, with 1 million Muslims. Second in Europe is Russia, with a bit over 14 million Muslims, or a bit over 10% of the country. By comparison, Sweden's Muslim population is at 4.6%. Now, admittedly, this figure does not include the very recent immigrants since July 2016, but even if we assume all of those are Muslims, Sweden's Muslim population still doesn't exceed 5%. In other words, Russia is twice as Islamized as Sweden is. And we rightfully mock Sweden for its pro-Islamic cuckoldry, mind you. Alright, but just because there are far more Muslims in Russia than anywhere else in Europe, just because Putin openly tolerates an Islamist dictatorship in Chechnya, and just because there are more mosques per capita in Russia than everywhere else in Europe, and is rather competing with Arab nations on this topic, that still doesn't mean Putin is necessarily a fan of Islamism, of building mosques, or is tolerating shenanigans from Muslims, right? Well, not really. Here's Vladimir Putin next to the Islamist Hamas dictator Mahmoud Abbas and neo-Ottomanist Turkish dictator Recep Tayyip Erdogan at the ceremony marking the opening of the Moscow Grand Mosque.
Президент государства Палестины Махмуд Аббас, президент Республики Турция Раджаб Таyyip Эрдоган, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
And when it comes to big Muslim holidays such as Ramazan Bayram or Eid al-Fitr, which marks the end of Ramadan, the Moscow Grand Mosque is not grand enough to serve the over 2 million Muslims in Moscow, that is 20% of the capital city's population. How do I know that? Well, I watched Russia Today, which is kind enough to provide us footage. Here's how the end of Ramadan looked like for the streets of Moscow last year. Alright, so far we have established the following. That more mosques have been built under Putin than the previous 200 years of Russian history. That there are not just Islamic no-go zones, but Islamic no-go countries within Russia. That there are more Muslims per capita in Russia than everywhere else in Europe except Bulgaria. That there are more Muslims in total in Russia than everywhere else in Europe. And that Islamic radicalism is not just tolerated but actively upheld by the Kremlin establishment, not just abroad but also within Russia's borders. Okay, but this doesn't mean that Putin himself holds Islam in high regard. And besides, he did bomb the hell out of ISIS, right? Right? Well, no. First of all, the overwhelming majority of Russian airstrikes in Syria targeted areas that are not, and many have never been, under the control of ISIS. Here's a map. With gray, it's ISIS territory. With pink, it's Assad territory. Darker pink is Hezbollah territory, and yellow is the rebel territory. All of these are hostile to ISIS. Putin's airstrikes hit the following in 2015. Talbiseh, Homs, Hama, and Idlib. Notice something? The common thread of these is that none of these are ISIS territory, and Homs and Hama never have been. Another common thread is that these are areas where anti-Assad forces are rather strong. Again, it is no secret that Bashar al-Assad is a Moscow ally, and let's not pretend that Putin defending his ally has had anything whatsoever to do with counter-terrorism or with fighting ISIS. Now that doesn't mean Russian airstrikes never hit ISIS. They did, roughly 10% of the time, but it does mean that ISIS was never a particular concern for Putin. Even ISIS themselves, in their own magazine where they detail their plans and promote their worldview, the magazine is called Dabik by the way, they also said the same thing, namely that Russian airstrikes had minimal impacts on them and their own positions. Links to all of these, of course, in the low bar. So yeah, the idea that Putin carpet-bombed ISIS or bombed the hell out of them or whatever propaganda syntagm is fashionable this week simply has no cover in reality. But still, that doesn't mean Putin likes Islam, right? Well, other than showing himself next to every Islamic dictator imaginable and inviting them to Moscow to speak at ceremonies as new mosques are being built and opened, Putin also seems to think that there is more in common between Orthodox Christianity and Islam than between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism. No, seriously, that's what he said. Here's the full quote in context. Quote, Russia originally evolved as a multinationality and multi-confessional state. You know, Orthodox Christianity, and some theorists agree with this, is much closer to Islam than to Roman Catholicism, close quote. Needless to say, such stance is theologically unsound, and that is me trying to refrain from saying that it's an absolutely retarded stance. But nevertheless, this is Vladimir Putin's stance on Islam as it concerns Christianity. The idea that this is a crusade leader that defends Christian values should be an example for the rest of Europe simply has no backing in reality. Quite the opposite. By comparison, Sweden is preferable, and mind you, I remind you again, we mock Sweden constantly. Anyway, in the next episodes we will look at demographics, standard of living in Russia, and the degree of degeneracy with a view to invite Western conservatives to think again before declaring Russia as a preferable alternative to the admittedly flawed liberal systems in most of Europe. If you think Russia is less degenerate, please do stick around for the next parts of this series. You're in for quite a few surprises. But until then, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.